Hello again, and welcome back to the latest session of the Going for Growth conference. Now, this is obviously a conference organised by the Centre for Policy Studies, the best think tank. I don't think anyone here would argue with that. But it turns out there are other people who have other opinions about what we should do with the economy. And we wanted to, in this session, get a diverse range of views from some of the heads of the other leading think tanks in the country, and just sort of argue the toss about, everyone agrees that growth is great and that we need more growth, but obviously there are many routes to that and many different priorities. So I'm delighted to be joined by the heads of, as I said, three of the leading other think tanks in the country: Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs; Will Tanner of Onward; and Polly Mackenzie of Demos. And in fact, that's the order that they're going to speak in. As before, as ever, if you have any questions, please do submit them via the CPS Think Tank Twitter address, via YouTube. We're also broadcasting on Facebook and on our website, and in all known languages and galaxies. I'm reassured by our tech team. But we've kept it down to 4 people so that we can have a lively discussion, and which will hopefully cover pretty much every aspect of the growth agenda. So, Mark, can I ask you to start with your vision for growth?
Sure, Rob, thanks. Good to be with you. I don't know whether the CPS is the best think tank, but the IEA is clearly the oldest and no doubt the wisest think tank represented here. I'm very grateful for the invitation. Let me just rattle through a few thoughts. Rob, you said at the outset, and I'm sure it's right, of the panelists joining for this session, and probably for those watching on YouTube, that everybody agrees growth is basically good, important, and matters. That's probably true of this cohort. I'm not so sure, however, it has been true overall in our public debate. If you were to look at, I think the environmentalist movement is specifically an anti-growth movement. I don't think Extinction Rebellion are particularly concerned about whether our growth rate is 3% or 0%, and quite probably prefer it to be 0%. So I think this is actually a contentious point, not one that any longer commands universal support across the spectrum. And I just want to rattle through, if you like, why I think those of sound mind need to reiterate why it matters, and what we should do about it. And why does it matter is, although GDP is not the absolutely optimal measurement for how well the human race is doing, there are all sorts of problems with it. I don't think it is the only thing in the world that we should care about, whether our GDP is going up more or less, but it's pretty close to being the ace of trumps in the deck. It's probably the thing that we should care about the most, even if there are other considerations. It's not necessarily an ace that we would always play. And I think there are interesting questions about how you trade off if your growth is temporary, because it's based on, let's say, debt, or whether it's damaging the environment, or whether you want to trade off growth for things like social cohesion and poverty relief. I think all of those are reasonable suggestions. Why does it matter, though? And I just very quickly did a little bit of compound maths before joining you. Let's imagine over the next 20 years, 4 different long-term growth rates for the United Kingdom. Very simply, 1%, 2%, 3%, and 4%. Let's imagine also, I think approximately the average wage is about £25,000 a year. Let's assume that the growth applies equally to all wage earners. If you're in the 1% band, roughly where the UK's been, I think we've probably got a long-term growth rate of a little higher than that, but not much. You'll see average wages in today's money hit 30,000, just over 30,000 in 20 years' time. If you're a little more ambitious and could get that to 2%, you'll see the average salary go up to about 37,000. If you're more ambitious still and think that the West should be returning to 3% average growth rates, then in 20 years' time, the average wage would be about 45,000. And if you're super optimistic and have a magic recipe for more growth, the average wage would be 54,000. Quite a band of different outcomes over a single generation, simply based on whether your growth rate is 1% or 4%. And in addition to my concerns about the environmental movement thinking growth's bad, I think there's a danger also that politicians treat growth as being a kind of exogenous feature, an act of God, whether the British economy is growing at 1% or 2%. And look, to some degree, acts of God or acts of other jurisdictions matter. Clearly, COVID-19 was not invented in Britain and has had a big impact on growth, but it's not a wholly exogenous fact. And I think that there are some substantial steps that we should take to positively encourage it so we can get average prosperity in the UK up to those sort of levels I've suggested. And I think you're going to be unsurprised at the two key propositions I've got. The first is regulation. I think that we have allowed regulation to hamper productivity. In my view, it is the biggest single answer to the productivity puzzle, that we have so much and so heavy regulation, and we always tend to bring in more without repealing stuff that may be useless or out of date. And in essence, we are therefore in danger of creating an economy in which we are spending, well, I was going to say all our time, not all of our time, but a very high proportion of our time complying rather than producing. And if you spend a large proportion of your time complying rather than producing, you can expect GDP growth to be sluggish. So on, once we're finally out of the European Union, I hope that there is a coordinated attempt to look at what's on the regulatory statute books and what is hampering growth, and very good reasons being needed to be given for any of those regulations that we wish to maintain and retain. And I'm not suggesting we burn the whole lot, I'm just suggesting we cross-examine the whole lot. And it seems nearly impossible to get the government of any stripe to engage in a bonfire of red tape, which prevents business growth and entrepreneurship in a large number of areas. I hope we get that. I hope Brexit's a trigger for that, and I think it could be. So plan A would be remove regulations which are extremely unhelpful to growth and of questionable impact in other areas. Plan B is on taxation. I think the overall burden of tax is too high, at about 38% of national income, there or thereabouts. Government spending is too high. Probably this year, because of the lockdown and the pandemic, will come in not very many points south of 50% of national income. And I think the economic literature on this is relatively clear. It's a social science, not an exact science. If you want the fastest rate of growth you can possibly manage, that tends to be correlated with a state sector that amounts to around about 20% of GDP. That's not the only thing that affects growth. If you've got a state sector spending 20% of GDP, but a very heavily regulated private sector, you might not get maximum growth. You can probably afford to have a larger government expenditure, a bit like Scandinavia, if you don't have such a firm regulatory state. But very rule of thumbish, if you want to maximise economic growth, 20% is probably the goodish number to be looking at. If you want to maximise immediate welfare, so you're not devil take the hindmost, and you want to make sure that you're happy to trade off a little bit of economic growth to, for example, make sure that you have a welfare programme that can combat poverty and nobody's dying or starving on the streets, you're probably looking at around about 30% GDP in the state sector. And we're presently raising about 38%, spending about 45%. So my two public policy recipes would be a long look at regulation. I know somebody will say, well, point to the ones, what are the ones that are really harming us? And I don't think there's any single regulation you can remove that would suddenly add 2% to growth. There's a million regulations that have a very minimal impact on growth. And I'm rather taken by pebble theory that regulating an economy is a bit like throwing pebbles into the River Thames. No single pebble will stop the flow of the River Thames, but if you stand by on the bank of the River Thames throwing pebbles in long enough, before many years are out, you stem the tide. And so a hard look at regulation post-Brexit, and an honest discussion about our long-term tax take position. I'm not appalled that the state sector grows in the context of a national crisis like coronavirus, but we are in danger of the government living beyond our means a little bit in the good times and living beyond our means a lot in the bad times. And that is not a sustainable long-term picture for the finances, and I think is leading to a state sector that's too large. So I hope this zero-based spending review is going to be a meaningful one. And my third point, which I'll finish on, Rob, because I know you only want to speak for a few minutes in these opening remarks, isn't so much a policy, it's more of a strategy. And it goes to my point about, I think there's a danger that too many people in government and in politics think that growth is largely exogenous rather than to a considerable degree a result of domestic policy. I would like the government to adopt growth as its principal objective, as its principal strategy, and to tell each sort of ministerial department any proposal or change in the law or bill that you come up with will be tested against what it does for economic growth. The more you can show that it will be a growth booster, the more likely we're going to fast track it. If you've got any suggestion that it's actually going to knock 0.1%, 0.3%, 0.5% off GDP for some other objective, we're going to cross-examine you on that very, very long and hard. So I'd like to see, quite apart from my two suggestions, which are around tax and regulation, it actually being a stated government policy to make growth its #1 objective, and to hold ministers and departments to account against that metric in a far stronger, far clearer way than we do it at the moment. That's why it matters, and that's what I do about it.
Brilliant. Well, Will, your own views. Yeah. So a bonfire of red tape and an end to throwing pebbles.
Thank you very much, Rob, for having me and being in the room with the self-professed best think tank in Westminster and the IEA, the oldest think tank in Westminster. It's nice to be the kind of the bright young thing showing the oldies how to do it. So I wanted to focus. I mean, I knew that I expected Mark to focus on tax and regulation, because that's what the IEA has historically done lots of work on. I wanted to focus on a few issues where I feel like there hasn't been enough economic debate, especially on the centre right, and where we do know that there are kind of long-term structural issues with the UK economy that we have just so far failed to resolve over many decades. And I think especially at a time right now where we do definitely need to grow the pie, we should be concentrating incredibly hard on growing the economy. I'm certainly not someone who thinks that growth doesn't matter, and a kind of a degrowth or no growther, as there are, as we said, Rob. I think we should be concentrating quite hard on what type of growth we want, and focusing on some of the political realities that have emerged from our economy over the last few years. So for me, there are, I think, 3 big structural weaknesses in the economy where policymakers have not made the inroads that they should have done in recent decades, and we need to concentrate on right now. And these weaknesses are weaknesses which not only hold back growth, but they hold back living standards, and in doing so, they also hold back our ability to fund the increasing costs of public services, which are likely to grow significantly in the next few decades. So the first one that I would pick is the UK's relatively low rates of fixed investment in machinery and human capital, which means we have just much less productive workers than comparable countries around the world. Fixed investment in the UK is lower than in every other OECD country, and has been in every year but one since the 1960s. British firms installed about half as many industrial robots as France last year, about 1/10 as much as Germany, and far, far, far less than countries like Singapore and others. And as a result, we do simply have much lower rates of productivity than those countries. We're 6th in the G7, behind only Italy, and that's only due to a recent revision in the statistics. And as we know, productivity growth in the UK for the last decade has been about 10 times lower than the average for the past preceding decade, about 0.2% compared to 2.5%. So I think the problem of fixed investment is something that we need to pay much greater attention to. The second point is something that is kind of growing in terms of political attention, but historically, certainly the Conservative Party and the centre-right hasn't focused on a huge amount, and that's the geographic balance of growth. The UK has the most geographically imbalanced economy in the industrialised world, and we know that that has a material effect on overall growth rates for the entire country. We know that more balanced countries grow faster, and if you look across if you look across the world, across large countries of the world, G20 countries, there are no countries that are more geographically imbalanced than the UK, but have a higher share of GDP per head. So there is a kind of direct correlation between our regional imbalance and the rates of growth. And if you look at what's happened over the last kind of 15, 20 years, we see that that is getting worse. So in 2004, to give you one example, London's economy was about the same size as the whole of the north of England. If you fast forward to today, London's economy is about 25% bigger than the north of England. That's the equivalent of adding Edinburgh, Swansea, Belfast, Bristol and Birmingham to the size of the capital in relative terms in the space of 15 years. So that problem of regional imbalance is getting worse, and thus the drag on growth from regional imbalance is rising. And then the third issue, which I think we need to take incredibly seriously, not least because of the stock as well as the flow, is the UK's long tail of low skills, which we've heard policymakers of every colour and stripe talk about for decades, but we have continually failed to properly address. So if you look at the UK labour market today, about 30% of the working age population is termed low skills, and about half of those, 4.2 million people, hold qualifications below level 2, so that's the equivalent of a D at GCSE. So the UK just has an incredibly weak kind of skills mix, and we're unique among developed economies in the sense that our 18 to 24-year-olds, so younger generations, have worse skills overall, a higher share of low-skilled people than 55 to 64-year-olds. So in terms of kind of cohort effects, other countries are likely to kind of increase their skills mix over the next few decades. If that pattern continues, the UK skills mix is likely to worsen. We are doing worse for this generation of young people than we were for previous generations in terms of their skills development. And we know that that has a very significant effect on levels of growth and productivity. People with higher levels of skills are more able to produce higher value goods and services in shorter spaces of time. They're also much more likely to weather the technological and economic storm that's happening through both globalization and digitization. So we know that essentially if a worker has a degree, they have significantly lower chance of automation than someone who doesn't, despite everything we hear about white collar workers being subject to automation too. And if you look at some of the reasons why that skills development has been particularly weak, a big part of it is declining employer investment in the skills of their workforce. So we estimated a few years ago that real terms employer spending on training is about £500 lower than it was in 2011 in real terms. That's a significant drop over a relatively short period. So those are the three things that I think policymakers should focus on as we think about returning to growth and digging ourselves out of the kind of unprecedented economic hole that we find ourselves in. I think we need to do much more to encourage capital investment in both human capital and fixed capital, machinery, technology, the type of things which are going to boost our productivity, both in the short term and materially in the long term. I think we need to radically improve the kind of the regional balance of our economy, and I would point to things like improving regional governance, in kind of thinking about taxes and thresholds which have a different regional balance to the ones that we have focused on previously. And we need to invest seriously in the skills of the UK labour market, because without that, without highly skilled workers, we are going to be left behind in terms of global competition over the next few decades. Thank you.
An optimistic take from Will there, but also an extremely powerful one. And now Polly.
Hello. I'm really glad to go last because it means that I can say that Mark and Will and Rob have all said lots of really sensible things about how we grow the economy. I want to start by saying something quite simple and obvious about what growth is, in that it's activity of some sort that creates value that we can measure. And this will be relevant later, but it's worth remembering that if I clean my house, that's not growth. If I pay somebody else to clean my house, it counts as growth. Well, I mean, not growth, but economic activity that's within GDP that we can then measure. And it's, I think, really important for us to observe that lots of the activity that brings value and joy to our lives and to our economy is in fact not counted within GDP. Nevertheless, there's a good reason for that. One is that if I clean my own house, I might be creating value. Cleanliness, I might be preventing a COVID infection, who knows? But I'm creating value that is not monetizable and easily transferred or taxed by the government in order for the government to take some of that money and do something else useful with it. So because it's not monetized or financialized, which is something that apparently is a bad thing, there's a reason why it's kind of left alone by the government and not worried about. Nevertheless, I think it's going to be important. It's important later in my argument. So nevertheless, growth is activity, increase in activity or the value created by activity. And that can happen broadly in two ways. One is, as Will was talking about very compellingly, increases in productivity, the amount of value that is created in an hour or a minute of that activity. But the other thing that we can do to create growth is have more people doing the activities. And actually through most of the Labour era, a huge amount of our growth happened because more people were coming into the economy. More people were shifting from doing activity that didn't count, some of which was really valuable, like cleaning their houses, and some of which was less valuable, like, I don't know, sitting in the park. They were moving into the economy. And that included three groups of people in particular. One, women. Huge numbers of women moved into the economy over the last 30 or 40 years. We are basically at peak women in the economy throughout the whole of our history. Immigrants, of course, especially during the Labour era when we had the accession countries from Europe, huge numbers of people came into the country and got counted within our GDP who wouldn't otherwise. And a lot of growth came from that. It didn't obviously yield GDP per capita growth in the same way as productivity gains do. Nevertheless, a lot of growth, a lot of tax revenue came from that. And the third was another group of older people. It hasn't been as transformative as the shift of women into paid activity, but nevertheless, because of changes in pensionable age and also just changes in the way people choose to live their lives, more older people are staying in the workplace longer, especially women. So older women, kind of, if you think about the Venn diagram, are included in those groups. So we are at a situation where if we want to create more growth, I basically agree with a lot of what Will said about how we can drive productivity, improving low-skilled workers' ability to be more productive by giving them more skills, investing in infrastructure so that people can be more productive during their time of work, investing in the fixed asset base so that all of that improves productivity, and that is fantastic. And there's lots of really great writing about productivity. I think there's a problem, though, if we don't also find ways to bring more people into the parts of activity in our society which we count for GDP. And that's not to say that those parts of activity which don't count for GDP, like caring, don't matter or don't bring importance to our lives. They absolutely do. Nevertheless, if you have, this is my kind of feminist view, you may disagree with it, but if you have a situation in which all of the unpaid activity is done by one gender and all of the paid activity is done by the other gender, that creates a power imbalance. I would much prefer to see us shift so that the paid work and the unpaid work is more equally divided between those of both genders or all genders, whichever way you prefer to see it. We have decided as a nation that the flow of migrants to grow our economy ought to reduce or stop. Perhaps not stop, but reduce certainly. Whilst we don't formally have the target around reducing net migration to the tens of thousands, nevertheless, the broad rhetoric of government is that we should be less reliant on migrant labour for low-skilled economy, for the low-skilled parts of our labour market in particular. And that means we've decided that growing our economy by just having more people in it doing more activity is kind of off the table. We've hit quite a difficult ceiling in terms of female labour market participation. The government's done good work on childcare investment, but we've seen through the coronavirus pandemic that actually more traditional patterns of split between female and labour and female and male domestic roles at home have been reinforced. and women continue to take on a very substantial majority of the unpaid domestic tasks, including cleaning. And it feels uncomfortable for liberals, for conservatives as well, I think, to try and sort of get involved in who's doing what inside the family home. I completely understand why people are skeptical that sort of micromanaging individuals' life choices in that way feels just kind of icky. Nevertheless, there are a whole range of different policy outcomes, and we could explore them, but I think we have to accept that the goal of supporting and enabling more women to transfer tasks from that unpaid to the paid part of our economy is going to be important if we want to see growth and the tax revenues that may then come from growth. And the third group is older people. We usually hear about older people as a problem. And during coronavirus, we have heard more and more calls that basically sort of be locked up systematically as a species. I think we should think about older people much less as a problem and much more as an opportunity. We've seen quite how much of our hospitality and our kind of town centre economy is reliant on older people who've got time and who've got money to spend. We should be doing much, much more to enable people to stay in the workforce for longer. And that's the area in which I'm most inclined to agree with Mark around taxes, whether it's income taxes or, for people with part-time earnings, or making sure that it's still worthwhile staying in the economy. And also we need to think about older people as entrepreneurs. We know there's a huge gap in female and male entrepreneurship, and one of the reasons is that women, partly because they're more likely, though of course there's plenty of examples of women who don't follow this pattern, women are just more likely to have domestic responsibilities at home that lead them, because they've got kids, to be more risk averse around putting, for example, their home at risk. But actually, I think empty nester women are an extraordinary resource when it comes to risk appetite, because they've suddenly got an amount of freedom and an age profile. We need to stop thinking about people who are 50 or 60 as being, just on the pipeline to being a problem because we've got to look after them in a care home, and start to think about that generation with experience and potentially, half a lifetime of earnings behind them and risk appetite, because potentially they're at that empty nest stage. So men and women, but especially women, because the entrepreneurship is so low there, as a source of innovation and potentially productivity growth. So all of those things, older people, women, migration, I think we need to put those back into the mix. And it might feel sometimes like social engineering, and I commend those who feel uncomfortable about that. But if we want growth, we need to think about how we get those people to participate in the paid part of our economy, because that's the pathway to growth.
Thank you, Polly. And just to sort of structure the discussion a bit. So as ever, please do send through some questions, and I'll put them to the panel. But I wanted to sort of just throw out a few things for us to think about. So the first is that there is a tension between short-term and long-term growth, the challenges that we face. So in the last decade, it has been the most consistent, assuming, let's say for the sake of argument, that GDP growth is a good thing and that we want more of it, that in the last decade, our GDP performance has been the most consistent it's been since the Second World War. Unfortunately, it's been consistently bad. GDP growth has not gone above 3% since the 2008 crisis. But even before that, I'm really glad Polly sort of mentioned migrants, because I've been playing around with the World Bank data on GDP per capita, and what you find is not just a sort of financial crisis effect, but effectively, like it feels like we're in a kind of Indiana Jones trap where the ceiling is coming down lower and lower. So, average growth per capita in the 1980s was 2.5%, which is kind of roughly the same level as which is roughly the same level as it was in the previous decades. During the 1990s, this falls to 1.9%. In the 2000s, it falls to 1.2%. And in the 2010s, even before we get this massive kind of fall from coronavirus, it falls down to 1.1%. And, if you strip out the recessions from that and look at downturns, essentially what you're seeing is when Gordon Brown said that he had abolished boom and bust, what it turned out he meant was that he and other politicians appeared to have abolished booms. That we, the years in which GDP had like a 3 or a 4 or even a 5 at the start of it, just kind of slowly start disappearing. So like in 97, Labour inherited a growth rate of about 3.6%, and it never gets there again. Even in the years before the 2008 crisis, which we now think of as the good times, GDP is still hovering at about 1.6 to 2.4%. So there are these big structural problems in the economy, which you all identified really well, and I'd agree with, obviously I'm head of the CPS, I'd agree with Mark on the tax and regulation point, but Will's absolutely right about productivity, geographical imbalances, skills, all the rest of it, and probably, too, about participation in the labour market. But the point is, now we are facing this immediate short-term crisis. To what extent do we prioritise fixing those long-term problems, even if it's going to cause us some pain now, or should we be trying just to get growth back up to where as quickly as possible to where it was before, and then we can start to think about fixing stuff? And the other sort of question I'd ask, obviously, is in terms of the public finances. Government's actions are going to have a huge impact on growth at the moment. In order to support the economy, the government is spending, vastly more money than it is taking in tax revenue. And the Treasury, especially, is starting to think this is a problem. At what point do you think we take off our Keynesian hats on, or rather, we do the bit of Keynes which no one ever remembers, which is that you need to actually balance the books again once you've done the stimulus spending? At what point do we do that? And when we do it, is it? Do you just let borrowing continue? Do you do a bit of financial repression? Do you cut spending? Do you raise taxes? What's your kind of your personal recipe for that? Which hopefully is quite a lot to be going on by, although I see we also have some questions coming as well, but I'll throw it to whoever wants to kick off on that.
Well, Rob, can I come back to you on the immigration point? Because Polly made some interesting points about what GDP doesn't measure, and I agree with that. And I'm delighted, actually, that you might remember a few years ago, sort of happiness economics became the big thing, that we were going to somehow try and work out not how rich you were, but how happy you were. And I can see the rationale behind that, because as I said, I think GDP growth is really important, but if you were to take a kind of reductio ad absurdum approach, you can see obvious ways in which you could increase GDP, but make people fairly miserable. You could.
Yes, the classic example is if you pollute a river and then clean it up again, it's wonderful.
Yeah. Or ban people from retiring, right? You say, you're 60 years old, you want to retire, you want to spend the rest of your life on the golf course, you can't. You have to continue to work as an investment banker until you're carried out in a coffin from whichever investment bank you're at. That would improve GDP, but wouldn't necessarily improve happiness. The problem with that, so there are all sorts of flaws, in the way that we measure GDP. It's not perfect. There's all sorts of flaws in how you measure happiness, because I think I'm right in saying whenever you survey the British people, we're a pretty phlegmatic bunch. We always come out at a 7, whatever's actually happened with the prevailing economy. So it's not obvious that informs public policy. The point that I wanted to take issue with was on immigration, because you could say that it's obviously not GDP that matters, it's GDP per capita that matters. I'm not even persuaded of that, because imagine a world in which we tackle full-on Polly's concern about the allocation of cleaning duties in domestic households. And we take this on because virtually every family in Britain hires a full-time domestic cleaner, a butler and a chauffeur from India. And each of these people are paid, let's say, £15,000 per annum. Well, it seems to me that would lower GDP per capita, because £15,000 is indeed below average GDP per capita. It's obviously, however, improved the earnings of those 3 Indians per household, because they would not be earning £15,000 per capita back in India. And it's also presumably improved the lives of the rest of us, because we no longer have to drive our cars, clean our houses, or make our own dinners. We now have 3 people doing it for them. So, but GDP per capita would fall. So I think that it's very difficult to get a grip totally on the what precise statistic are we looking at. And I don't think we should be complete central planners on looking at one metric and saying that and that alone is what we're going to
I'm actually saying I am obviously personally very, quite keen on immigration, especially high skilled immigration. My mother was a teacher from New Zealand. Most of my family have married people from overseas.
So no, sorry, I wasn't accusing you of racism, Rob, or anything like that. I know you're not. I'm just saying that the point that you make is an interesting one because it goes to GDP per capita, but you might actually imagine a world, the one I've just painted, albeit an extreme example, in which GDP per capita falls, but actually the UK is in a better position with immigration and relatively low skilled work coming in. I mean, I think what to aim for, which is why I kept my points very general and I was interested in what Polly and Will said, but I think most of those things can be achieved or encouraged by market reforms. Yeah, of course, I'd like us to have a better education system. I don't necessarily think that the solution to that, however, is further directives from the DFE on exactly what mechanical engineering skills a 14-year-old boy or girl needs to learn in order that they're better in the manufacturing industry. I think we should take a more meta approach to many of these things. Very interested in what Will said about regional disparities in growth. I'd like to hear more from him about whether that's a problem. I mean, if I had a plan that I could prove to you over the long run would see London grow at 5% a year and the rest of the UK grow at 4% a year, would Will want to execute that plan? Or would he feel that it's fundamentally insecure because London would be pulling away from the rest, even though the rest were growing at 4% per annum? At what point do you get that tilt where I'm undermining long-term growth? I mean, on the face of it, if there was such a plan I could roll out that gave us those numbers, I'd pull the trigger right away. And I'm not that bothered about the regional imbalances. And as long as everybody's growing, I don't mind if the richer areas are growing faster, if you've got a plan to do that. So my approach would be on all of the things raised, what is the best framework that the government can produce to give us the best shots of these things, of improving the education system with regard to skills, of encouraging whether it's women or older people to enter or remain in the labour market. And I remain adamant that that framework is one in which tax and regulation are presently too high. I do take a long-term view on that. I'm not utterly panicked that this year's budget deficit will be the worst in history. That's livable with, but it's not livable with over the longer run. So I think if we were taking a 5 or 10 year time horizon, I would have thought that most sensible people, really from across the political spectrum, should be able to agree that we are taxing and spending beyond our long-term capability, and therefore we need to have a serious discussion about how we slice up a smaller pie in the public sector and what our priorities are. If it is the NHS, then it can't also be education and defence and the police force. And that we have a serious discussion about how we're going to, again, at a meta level, tackle red tape. And that doesn't just mean you just throw it all on the bonfire, but what process are we going to go through on sunset clauses, on properly measuring the impact? And I think if you get those sort of meta things right, most other things fall into place, which is not to say that you are certain of getting it 100% right, but a good number of the concerns, the wholly legitimate concerns raised by Will and Polly, I think are heavily mitigated.
Well, Polly, do you want to go next, just so we don't just repeat the order from before?
Sure. I think Mark's just said that people from across the political spectrum think that the state should be smaller, and I mean that's probably true about this year, given as you say, Mark, like this is an anomalous year in which we have spent a huge amount. So we've got some work from demos coming out next week where we've done a lot of exploratory work with the public around the future of the tax system. I don't want to spike my own report because that would be self-defeating, but we had to explore with people this fundamental choice that our demographics mean that demand for even status quo public services is rising, particularly because of I've said we're not allowed to talk about old people as a problem. Nevertheless, certainly inactive older people create more of a burden on those who are active in the economy. It's one of the reasons why I think more people should be active. So if you want just standstill quality public services, given there's a whole range of ways in which the tax base is falling, then we have to find a way to tax more, or you have to cut back those services and people's expectations. And I think when you explore that with the public, it's really quite rare for people to say that what they want is dramatically lower public services. Of course, if you can pull off 5% growth, you get to the point where the economy is growing so fast that lots of those trade-offs are reduced or perhaps even removed altogether. Nevertheless, that's quite a political journey for people to go on, and I don't think there is at the moment at least, a coherent plan that I've seen that sees any of the countries of the West really returning to the levels of growth that they achieved in the 80s or early 90s. But so I think when it comes to fiscal policy, there is extraordinary pressure, but the pressure will be towards spending more. And whether that spending more is sustained by deficits, because we have both the modern monetary theory crowd on the left and the sod it, let's just spend because that's what the Americans do. I mean, the Americans have like the exorbitant privilege of a deficit that no one seems to give a damn about, of, I don't know, 93 trillion or whatever it is. People who are sort of, well, let's be like America. Who cares about this whole like making the books balance? Like sound money has gone massively, massively out of fashion on left and right. So I think the pressure will be to spend more, whether it's on infrastructure, like Will's talking about, whether it's on levelling up, whether it's on decarbonising, and then also on those public services which people demand. People demand the defence spending, they demand the police spending, and we don't have, certainly at the moment, a government with enormous appetite for saying, I'm sorry, it's all too expensive, in the way that austerity or public service spending cuts commanded public support a decade ago, and they simply do not now. So I mean, that's all just context really, and I don't want to hog the debate, but I just think we have to be really careful about where the political balance lies now, and if we think that the only pathway to growth is much lower taxes and much lower regulations, well then we're like, I don't see a political pathway to that settlement. Personally, I think there are other pathways to growth, but we shouldn't claim political hegemony if it's not there.
Will, you're nodding vigorously.
Yeah, no, I have a lot of sympathy for everything that Polly just said. David Willits had a wonderful phrase in one of his books from the 1990s where he said, if you want to reduce the supply of public services, then you should first reduce the demand for public services. And the reality is that in most polls, we find certainly, and I think this is replicated by British Social Attitudes and others, that at least 2/3 of people are in favour of the government reducing the gap between the rich and poor rather than growing the economy. And they have a strong support for investment in public services against kind of deregulation and tax cuts and reducing the size of the state. So it doesn't seem to me at all that people like Mark and others who make the argument for significant reduction of the size of the state and significant tax cuts alongside that have convinced the ordinary voter. And I think that's the prerequisite for anyone claiming that that's a viable course of action over the next few years. As Polly says, the argument is actually really going in the other way if you talk to ordinary folk. That said, I think there are things that we can do. I personally don't think that we certainly need to hold on to the concepts of sound money. We need to ensure that if we are increasing our spending, we are finding ways to pay for it or finding savings elsewhere in the system in order to pay for it. I'm not one of these people who thinks that we can just increase public spending through deficit spending and borrowing. That would be entirely inappropriate, and it would just be taxes deferred for the next generation. And let's be honest about that. Let's not kid ourselves. But I think there are things that we can do. I mean, I'm a great proponent of tax simplification and regulatory simplification. That doesn't necessarily mean reducing the overall burden, but I think there is a lot that we can do to improve certainty, stability, and the kind of long-term context for business and other investment. I think so. You could look at tax relief. So you could look at You look at different regulations, Mark and others, the experts on the complexity of the regulatory system. But there are things that we can do within the overall envelope as it stands, and we should do those things. And then the thing that I mentioned briefly when I was talking before, but I really think could be the most important thing we could do, is to improve the governance of the United Kingdom. I mean, our markets and our labour markets, and if you look at the kind of regional economy, we have incredibly weak, patchy, and often pretty kind of imbalanced governance. We have some cities like London and increasingly Manchester who have largely self-contained economic leadership and governance. We have other places which have almost entirely absent economic leadership and governance. That patchwork quilt is a massive kind of hamper on growth. It holds growth back, and it makes business decision making increasingly complex and difficult. So I think, and that's not necessarily about increasing spending or reducing spending. That's spending the money that we do spend better, and thinking about the structures which kind of exercise that spending and are held accountable for those decisions.
And I'll just chip in. I mean that's the thesis of Adrian Woolridge and John Micklethwaite's new book, which it is essentially that the dividing line in COVID is not between big state and small state countries. It's between those which actually have governments that work and governments that don't. And Britain has been sort of fairly exposed on that front. I mean, obviously, I would sort of lean towards Mark's point on tax and deregulation. I think there is a sort of trap here that, the lower growth becomes, the more politics has become about cake sharing rather than cake growing, and then you end up in a sort of self-fulfilling situation where if I sort of felt Corbynism was almost the incarnation of this. That if you've all convinced yourself that growth isn't going to come back, then it makes perfect sense for politics to be defined by getting pissed off about how much rich people have, because the idea that you can become rich yourself has sort of drained away from public discourse. And that brings us onto one of the questions we've had, which is the talking about this decline I've mentioned. This is kind of long-term thing, dwindling GDP. I mean, what's your kind of take on why that's happened? I mean, obviously, as Polly mentioned, there is a kind of similar pattern in many of the developed countries, but I think it's fair to say our GDP has been more sluggish. Is this one big thing, e.g., productivity, or is it Mark's pebble theory again? Just a lot of little things mounting up to choke off the animal spirits of the economy.
I don't know who wanted to go first, Robert. But I'm happy to jump in. So just on your point about Adrian Woolridge and his new book, Philip McCann from Sheffield University is the real guru on this and on the kind of governance problem in the UK. And I'd highly recommend his book, The UK's National Regional Economic Problem, to your audience. So on the causes, I mean, there's obviously intense debate about this amongst economists, and new data seems to come to light, which shows a kind of different set of explanations almost on a monthly basis. I think, to my mind, some of the things that I mentioned earlier are probably most at fault, not least because they all seem to be going in the wrong direction. If you look at skills, if you look at fixed investment in the economy, and if you look at kind of regional balance and regional governance, all of those things are becoming less conducive to growth and productivity growth over the long term, and certainly over the last 40 years or so have worsened. So for me, it is the structural conditions, the kind of foundations of the economy that we have let wither. Now, some of that is a lack of public investment. Some of that, bluntly, is a kind of failure to create the conditions for the private sector to invest. And I'm certainly not saying the solution is only public sector-led activity. It must be both. But ultimately, government sets the rule book. Government sets the terms of the game. And if the government hasn't been paying attention to those things over a long period, then those things have deteriorated in kind. And I think that those are the core kind of problems that I foresee.
Mark, Polly?
Shall I come in? I think I agree with Will on that. I certainly also agree about the governmental structure being peculiarly bad in the UK. We have a highly centralised state, and the extent to which we have decentralised decision making is hugely asymmetric and complex, and a good amount of that decentralisation is not, in my view, sufficiently serious. The powers that we have removed from Westminster and given to regions or councils or assemblies or parliaments is not great enough. I'd much prefer a much more federal structure. But to your point, Rob, about what's going wrong, again, I think I'm sort of with Will. I mean, if you were to look at sort of 10 dials, each of which affect whether you're going to get economic growth, I think, if you like, nearly all of those dials have turned somewhat in a bad direction. They're not all turning in a disastrous direction. I mean, I can quote that the tax take this year is the highest for 50 years, not by a massive amount, and it might be at the end.
Well, I don't think the tax take, it was the highest for
Well, as a proportion of GDP, it might even still be yet higher, just because GDP's gone back 8%, right? And it might be that tax takes go down 19%. Your tax take as a proportion of GDP is higher. So, but not massively so. I'm not trying to be hysterical here. It's just by a dial. Regulation has got worse by a few notches. I agree our education and skills system has been found wanting. The fiscal position of the UK has deteriorated. Our overall national debt is worsening. Our long-term liabilities are worsening. None of these of themselves sort of push you over the edge of the cliff. I'm not predicting an apocalypse, but if you like, each of the dials that you might think are those that would tend to lean towards improved economic growth or worsening economic growth. All of those dials, one way or another, are just being slowly, gradually dialed to worse. And if all of the dials are slowly, gradually being turned to worse, the compound effect of that is pretty serious. I think that I'm with Albert Einstein on this, that the eighth wonder of the world is compound interest. Those who understand it gain from it, those who don't understand it pay it. And if we are going to be short term, and I was interested what Will and Polly were saying about the polling of the public, not just my observations about the views of the political class. If we are a country who, by and large, believes that what matters is how much we spend on public services this year or next, not the compound interest, the compound maths of economic growth over a generation, we've got a problem. We will be the people who suffer from the eighth wonder of the world, compound maths. And as I say, I at the top of the show, I rattled out my numbers about why growth is important if you were to look at average earnings. I just looked at that again on, let's assume that you want to spend per person in Britain in the public sector £12,000 per annum. If you get that low growth rate of 1%, then in 20 years' time, the prevailing overall tax rate will have to be about 40% in order to spend that amount. You could actually spend a little more with a prevailing tax rate of nearly 23%, practically half, if you were able to find a mix of policies that gave you a 4% long-term growth rate rather than a 1% long-term growth rate. Now, that's precious little consolation to someone who wants an NH operation now, or wants, an improved teaching for their kids now, not in 20 years' time, or wants better armed forces now rather than investment over 20 years. But to my mind, it shows the battle that people, Rob, on your and my side of the ledger, who think that tax and regulation are important issues and are going in the wrong direction, we've got to win the compound math question, because over 20 years, this has a colossal difference. And if we can't persuade the public of that, and Will's and Polly's polling seems to indicate that we haven't, then I'm afraid we are going to be stuck in the question of how to slice up a relatively small and shriveled pie, rather than how to cook more efficiently a bigger pie.
Well, Polly, you alluded in earlier to there being alternative models of growth and alternative ways in which it's not just about cutting taxes and regulation and unleashing the private sector. Is it about Dominic Cummings creating his own gigantic new tech companies, or what are the alternative options out there?
I think if we look at of a period of high growth, there's two things going on. One is, right, and so when I was little, we had a really rubbish hot water system, and so quite often my mum would run a bath and it wasn't really warm enough, so she would get like a kettle full of boiling water and pour that in, and obviously it spread out. That just took it up, that took the temperature of the bath up, right? Like, I promise this is a useful metaphor. So there's lots of kind of structural, complicated, pebble-sized things that are pebbles, heat, you know what I mean, that are slowly warming up your bath of growth.
We seem to be gravitating towards aquatic / thermodynamic.
Yeah, exactly. But there have been these things which we could kind of pour in. And I've mentioned a couple of them, which is this huge transfer over a generation of women into the paid labour market. And then you've got the raising of the retirement age and the massive reduction in the number of people who are leaving the labour market in old age. And then you've got other things like North Sea oil, or the Big Bang, and the removal of huge chunks of stultifying financial markets regulation, which meant that nobody could really get a decent mortgage. And that then liberated a whole bunch of house buying. Or then you have Right to Buy, which of course converted state spending from the 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s into basically cash now for people. And these, I sort of think of them as kettles of water being put in. And Dom, I understand, he wrote on his blog once, this metaphor, which is usually used about immigration, that there are literal $1 trillion bills in the street just waiting to be picked up. And that $1 trillion bill to me is a bit like the kettle. It's the thing that's over and above your let's be sensible and increase the marginal thing. There's just some big extra thing we get to chuck in. And if it's inventing a Google, it's something like that. But there are other, it's why I think there's still a lot to be gained from getting women up to the same labour market participation as men, or shifting the way we deal with older people. Or I would have migrants. I think that we need to think about what are the big chunky kettles of hot water that can help lift the sensible, reasonable kind of marginal stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the depressing alternative to that to do it is to just think that we've reached the top and we've had to stop. The bath, the plumbing is now as fixed as it can be.
Yeah, but that's not true, is it? Because there are other countries with higher GDP per capita than us, right? And I mean, I don't think I would want to live in America for a whole bunch of reasons, but there are other, I don't know, Luxembourg's a weird anomaly. I don't think we should just say, oh, there is no more growth, there's no more productivity. There are kettles out there. We just need to put them to boil.
I think the problem with this is, can I stretch this analogy to breaking point?
Yes.
I mean, my worry here is that unlike Polly's highly diligent and intelligent and sensible mother, the state has a tendency to unnecessarily boil the kettle 3 times, spill most of the water on the way to the bathroom, and then pour it over the child's head and scold the child while they sit in an otherwise cold bath. So the question to my mind is, if all these kettles are sitting around and can be efficiently deployed, is the state or the private sector the better way to deploy them? And I think I would trust Polly's mother considerably more than I would trust the state to engage in that sort of heating up the economy activity.
Mark, you have not met my mother. She ran a loss-making business and was propped up on income support for a good decade.
Well, at least in this instance of bath heating, I think.
On the bath heating, well. The pro.
I mean, Will, do you have any more aquatic metaphors to throw in, or should I go to the last question?
I did go to the last question. I can't better Mark's wonderful analogy.
So 2 minutes. Just had a 2-minute warning. So one final question, which it's sort of can be part of your concluding remarks. Just a very simple question from one of our viewers. What one thing would you change? What's the one thing that would get the economy moving in your view? My view on this, as it always has been, is build a load more houses.
I'm with you, Rob. Like houses. The planning system sucks.
I'm not sure that would be one regulation that you could repeal, and I would agree with Polly and Rob on that. I have to say, I don't think there is a silver bullet. I think there are lots of bronze bullets to fire. Some might be closer to silver than others. I think it's that the government needs to have a strategy around growth, and I don't think it has one. It has strategies for everything else, from obesity to beating COVID-19 and God knows what else. But when it actually comes to how do you want to see the economy grow and do we prioritise that, I actually think getting that to the top of the agenda and the list, and then all of these are baubles on that tree, whether it's then planning reform or deregulation of the financial sector or lowering the tax burden in certain areas, that follows from it. But it's actually a matter of political will. And the best thing would be for us to encourage politicians and those with the ability to actually change public policy to put economic growth basically at the top of the list of priorities, and to have a plan that stretches not over 2 or 3 weeks, but over a generation or more.
Will, final words?
Well, I have a lot of sympathy for what Mark just said about there being lots of bronze bullets rather than a single silver one. But the thing that I would say is that I think for us to return to a strong growth-led model, we need to return legitimacy to growth. And I think one of the big problems over the last decade is that not necessarily, I mean, we obviously haven't had particularly strong growth, but the growth that we have had has been perceived to be lopsided. This is one of the reasons why I'm a great proponent and supporter of the government's efforts on levelling up, because I think bringing opportunity and prosperity to parts of the country and groups of people who have missed out on it or been left behind, as it were, is fundamental to regaining some of that economic legitimacy for the voters who bluntly are the most volatile and most important for winning elections. So the most important thing that we can do for growth as a whole is to make growth popular again. And I think levelling up is the way in which to do that.
Well, that is not only making growth popular again is not only the subject of a lecture I'm giving in about a week and a half's time, if I ever finish writing it, but making growth, spreading growth to all is the topic of our final session in 10 minutes time. So thank you, Will, for the perfect segue. Thank you all very much for joining us. Please do join Guy Opperman, Richard Holden, Gerard Lyons, Helen Barnard, and myself, rather than Nick King, who's been fallen victim to the quarantine rules, for our final and equally wonderful session on securing an economic recovery for all. Just thank you again to my panelists, and thank you all for watching.
Thank you.
Thanks.